Stunned silence. That was the only way to describe the reaction of the others. The north wind abruptly stopped swaying. Otto set down his tea. The ferryman glanced at Chime with a blank stare. The pretender tilted her head in confusion, and Mush stayed frozen like a statue, like a record that was suddenly took off the player. Chime felt the gazes and immediately rubbed at the back of his neck, giving off a weak chuckle. Right? My bad, he said, weakening, trying to turn away in slight embarrassment. I, didn't think about planning ahead. His voice trailed off, growing distance. I just wanted to get back. The shaky statement changed the others' reactions. Within seconds, all of them understand the unspoken meaning. The first four sighed, giving Chime a somber smile. Before they tried to change the subject, however, they all struggled to find something else to talk about. Their attempts were cut off, however, as Chime cleared his throat while he leaned forward, his tone turning more serious. The end goal is still the same. The other listened in without a word, all gaining expressions of weariness and concern, certain memories trickling back into their minds. With a sigh, Chime steeled himself as he began to lay out details that the others had wanted to know since the cycle's beginning. When I was gone, Chime tugged at his collar, pressing his teeth together as he tried to force the words out. I was fighting it. Everyone besides Much snapped their heads towards Chime, all with looks of either shock or horror. Chime held up his hand, silencing the others before they could launch a barrage of questions. I know. Gently he sighed, leaning back into the leather chair while he looked off into the distance, lost in thought. Long story short, at the start I managed to hit the things. I guess. His lips pressed into a thin line, trying to put together something that could both explain what was needed while also keeping it short. Okay, here's what's important, he stated, deciding to skip most of the details. That thing has my arm, he said, pointed towards the said missing arm. The others nodded along without a sound, letting Chime explain further. He leaned forward again, each second adding to his nerves. I can kill it, he said with certainty, the kind the others all knew and loved. But I need my arm back. Turns out with it missing, I can't do everything. That made the others pause. It was the first time they had heard something so weak from Chime. It clearly affected Chime too, as the one-armed boy frowned in a swirl of emotions too dense to explain. The sudden voice of the north wind cut through the tense atmosphere like a knife through butter as he tried to get what he thought was the most important part of the current topic. All right. How would you do that? Chime glanced up at North once again, trying to put together a proper explanation. I need something to push me through. An extra charge. Chime looked away, his tone making it clear he wasn't satisfied by the idea, or at the very least his explanation of the idea. Also looking away in thought, the others began to silently brainstorm, setting another tense atmosphere throughout the air. It was the ferryman who broke the silence as he slowly turned to Chime, his tone unsure and careful. What if we got your weaver? Everyone paused, at first blinking in confusion before the memories came flooding back. Slowly Chime turned his gaze towards the ferryman, the light of his eyes brightened as a smile was pulled across his lips. That could work? With that, Chime held out his hand for a fist bump, his smile being felt through the air. Thanks, Joseph. Joseph gave a grateful smile, tapping his larger fist against Chime's frail fingers. Much to everyone's surprise, Chime pushed himself up off the chair, his energy now seeming just a little bit higher. He swayed on his, managing to keep his balance thanks to Joseph, who clasped a hand on the one-armed boy's shoulder. Giving the guide to nowhere a small nod, Chime stepped forward, his movements still sluggish and painful, yet they were now edged with something akin to excitement. The idea of finally making any kind of progressing filling Chime with an almost childlike glee. With that, Chime moved to head back towards the path that the north wind had taken him down, clearly intending to leave the cave as a whole. He gave a quick nod towards the maze, signaling the others to follow him. They did so, although with mixed reactions. The north wind floated down with a cheer, slipping next to Chime before wrapped an arm over the one-armed boy's neck, barraging him with questions, all of which was directed towards any potential stories Chime could tell. Otto moved next, though he did so with a sigh, muttering about how grouping up at the cave had been mostly pointless. Yet he didn't care, as he found that Chime's enthusiasm was like a weight was being lifted off his shoulders. It was exactly like he remembered. Watching the three making their way back through the maze of the cave, the pretender let a small sigh leak from her mouth. The excitement that filled the others was lacking when it came to motivating her to move forward. She stayed leaning against the wall, rolling her tumps around each other. She couldn't begin to describe what she was feeling. Mush watched as the pretender shook her head to dispel whatever she was thinking about before he pushed herself off the wall to follow the other three. He was about to follow suit, trying to once again keep as low a profile as possible. Yet that plan was ripped to pieces once heavy footsteps set themselves next to Mush. It was the ferryman whose bulky figure had stepped next to Mush without a word. Shrinking away with a wince, Mush tried to pull into himself further, even though he was already resembling a snail that had hidden away in its shell. Yet as Mush prepared himself for another emotional thrashing like the pretenders, the ferryman simply stood in place, staring at Mush with his hollowed-out eyes. The ensuing silence made Mush feel as if he was being crushed by an industrial press, each passing moment adding to the weight that pushed down on him from the inside and out. But the ferryman never moved in gaze, staying locked onto the now quivering Mush. His hatred could be felt through the air just like the others. But it was different. Instead of a raging fire or freezing cold ice, being near the ferryman felt like being pulled underwater each second, making Mush believe that his lungs were being filled with some sappy viscous liquid. The ferryman did speak, eventually, his voice low and eerily even. "You?" He cut himself off, finding that wherever he was about to just wasn't good enough. Mush nodded nonetheless, picking up on the unspoken message instantly. "Yeah," was his shaky reply, still finding himself unable to look towards the ferryman. Another suffocating silence passed over the two as Mush tried to muster up the strength to move onwards. It didn't work. The sudden sound of the ferryman shoving his hands into his coat's pockets made Mush flinch. However, before he could look up, the ferryman had already walked away, trying to catch up with him and the other. Mush slowly followed after. In the fields of the grassy wasteland, Chime stood in between the North Wind and Otto, who were both flinging question after question towards him, although their tones did vary. The North Wind was like a hyperactive child, constantly sliding his feet across the ground while he excitedly asked Chime about moments from his 240,000-year-long battle. So if the blood stuff's like acid, how come you still have you feet?" Chime sighed, though it lacked any form of annoyance, as he rolled his neck. "Just pushed it away." The North Wind understood straight away, and while he found the answer a little boring, he did understand the needs for Chime to be efficient. Otto was the next to speak, his tone more subdued as he tried to change the subject. "So, where are we going now?" Chime hummed before he glanced up at Otto. "Well, we gotta get moving somehow." Before Otto can ask for a further explanation, Chime rolled his neck to the side, glancing to the ferryman who was now catching up. "Hey Joseph, you made sure to dock your boat, right?" Was Joseph's simple answer as he fell into step beside the pretender, who was still lost in thought. Chime nodded in approval, upping his pace slightly while the others moved to catch up. And so their walk across the wasteland continued for the next few hours, as the old friends used that time to chip away at time they had spent separated, though each of them knew it was only the tip of iceberg, for better or for worse. The group eventually reached their desired destination, which sat resting against a small bed of land, much like the boat Chime and Mush had used. This one, however, belonged to the ferryman, which was easily deduced thanks to its sheer size. Separating from Chime, the North Wind floated up to the side of the enormous boat, balancing along the edge with instinctual ease. Chime hobbled over to the boat with the assistance of Otto, who had slung an arm over his shoulder, almost treating him as if he was bleeding out. Whatever Chime was thinking about was something he kept to himself, as he was pulled to the same edge of the boat that the North Wind stood upon. Chime shook away his partly put-together thoughts as the North Wind made a slight spinning gesture with his wrist. A funnel of wind formed underneath the one-armed boy, spinning around in a cyclone before it began to lift him upwards, almost like being pulled up while resting in a hammock. Taking a second to balance himself, Chime was set down on the same edge of the boat before the one-armed boy slowly slid down to its center, pulling himself onto one of the seats nearest the back. Keeping his gaze on Chime, the North Wind repeated his gesture, pulling Otto in nearly the exact same way, although Otto did take a second to dust off his vest once he settled on the wooden boat. Suddenly a shadow loomed over the three, causing them to turn slightly, though not in fear or panic, as they knew fine well what it was. The sudden was Joseph, who had turned back into his ferryman form, his melted face hiding any emotions as he stood to the side of his boat, waiting for the remaining two to get on. Leaping into the air without another thought, the pretender landed in the boat with a thud, shaking the wooden ship slightly before she settled on the same seat as Chime, although she sat a little ways away, still lost in her own thoughts. Last and definitely least, Mush moved to the back of the boat, a tendril of flesh already pouring out his hand. It slivered up the wooden shine, as if it were tar hooking over the edge before it pulled Mush up and onto the boat. Mush pulled the flesh back, regaining his hand. Once he did so, however, his focus stayed elsewhere as he tried to figure out a way to stay away from the others while still staying on the boat. At first he considered hanging off the edge, but he quickly decided against it, eventually deciding to just slump down at a corner of the boat, hoping that he could be left alone. To Mush's surprise, his wish seemed to be granted as the ferryman rested his hand against the boat's edge before he gently pushed it towards the water. The boat slipped into the gentle waves, with the ferryman carefully stepping onto the boat as if did so. Slowly he sat at the front, his back turned to the others while he wrapped his fingers around the paddles. He pushed the oars into the water, pulling the boat across the waves with mindless ease. He wasn't really paying attention to his movement, his muscle memory was doing the work for him. Instead, he had diverted his attention to listen to the world around him. Or rather, the people now sitting in his boat. Chime hadn't moved from where he had first sat down. He still stayed next to the North Wind, who had returned to constantly barraging Chime with questions that somehow sounded excited. Standing in front of Chime was Otto, who had his arms held behind his back while his face was turned into a confused and nervous expression. Chime glanced at the taller man, tilting his head to the left. "What wrong?" His voice was still dry and coarse, yet it held a softness that lessened Otto's worry, if only slightly. Taking a deep breath through his nose, Otto made the eye currently acted as Chime's eyes. "Where are we going now?" Otto asked while his lips pressed into a thin line, as he already had an idea on Chime's answer. Said boy paused, before he chuckled nervously, shrinking away slowly. "Ah, right," Otto sighed, his suspicions confirmed. The North Wind paused his questioning, tilting his head to an almost comical degree. "Where we going? Can't you just bring it to us like normal?" Chime and Otto glanced at each other before Chime gestured to his missing arm. That made the North Wind pause again, his voice turning slightly shaky. "Oh right, sorry," was all the North Wind managed to say before Chime sighed, while he leaned forward, resting his chin on his palm. The sudden reminder of Chime's new limits made the three cut back on whatever they were about to say. A low hum flowed through the air, pulling Chime's, Otto's, and the North Wind's attention to its source. The ferryman's deep voice echoed throughout the air, his hum turning into something almost like a growl, though it lacked any form of animosity. Rather, it was simply one of his many habits one used to show when he was getting ready to speak his mind. Would tracking it work? He mumbled, turning his head towards Chime, who began to drum his fingers against his knee. Eventually Chime nodded, running the idea through his mind. Yeah, that could work. Now, with at least some form of a solution, Chime's mood lightened instantly. However, Otto found the answer less than satisfactory as he raised an eyebrow towards the ferryman. "And how, pray tell, do we track it?" Not missing a beat, the ferryman let out another grunt. "The steam stack," he answered simply. That made the others pause, even getting Mush to look up with a stare that at first was one of confusion before it turned into one of realization. The statement made the others perk up, old memories being recalled to the surface. "That place is still around?" Otto asked, a hint of disbelief evident in his tone. The ferryman nodded, turning back to the ocean that was now fully in view. "Aye," he answered, simply beginning to row with increased intensity. With the short and simple answer, the others found themselves satisfied as Chime smiled softly, happy at it having a more tangible goal. The North Wind bounced in his seat, excitedly reminiscing on Founder's times he had almost forgotten. Otto immediately went to work planning out the best possible path. The pretender took in the information subconsciously, while Mush simply nodded, willing to just go with whatever the others were planning. Chime turned to both the North Wind and Otto, ready to discuss the new development, but a near-silent voice cut him off. Chime, the voice called calm and steady. The other turned to the voice, seeing the pretender, who was sitting at the edge of the boat, watching the ocean's waves with a distant gaze. Said boy tilted his head, although he was able to pick up the underlying message as he slowly stood to see what she wanted. Otto and the North Wind were ready to follow, however, a sharp glare from the pretender froze them in place like statues. They knew that glare, they knew what it meant, and safe to say they were not willing to argue. With that, the north wind and Otto swiveled on the spot before they scooted over to the opposite side of the boat, giving the pretender the space she desired. Chime stepped next to the pretender, waiting for her to elaborate on her call. Instead, she slid along the seat, giving just enough space for Chime to slot himself between her and the boat's edge. He did so without a second, though however her continued silence did seem to put him on edge. As Chime sat down, the pretender shifting her gaze, moving to stare down at the floor of the boat, all while Chime waited patiently for her to say, "Well, anything." Yet she said nothing. That made Chime begin to sweat his mind, hurriedly trying to figure out what was causing her silence. At first he suspected that it had something to do with how he hadn't had a full one-on-one conversation with her. But he knew that wasn't it. And so he turned to her, still trying to decipher the cause for her silence. Then she met his gaze with her own. Perfect still purple eyes met the glowing green that hid behind Chime's curtain of hair. She sighed. She knew what he had been doing. Unlike the others, she could pick apart the trick. The light of his eyes. The light he had been using to redirect their attention, to keep it away from what he didn't want them to see. Chime felt the gently weight of her gaze, feeling like a pressure that pushed down on him from all sides. He chuckled nervously, trying to breaking the ice. Her eyes remained locked towards his while his hands reached down as he clamped around his wrist. She pulled his hand upwards, effortlessly holding it between the both of them. Then Chime froze. Her eyes moved from the light of his eye before it settled on his hand, her focusing honing in instantly. Although it wasn't on how bony the hand was, nor was it on how it was shaking slightly. No, her focus was on the scars. The sight was enough to make most people vomit. Layers upon layers of scar tissue piled on top of one another, each layer made up of a different type of injury. From slashes, burns, punctures, tears, bite marks, and even some infections, all covered every pore of his visible skin. Simply put, if someone weren't to believe that Chime had been fighting for 240,000 years, the scars would be all the proof they needed. Chime froze once the pretender's gaze settled on his hand, any form on nerves subsiding into brief shock before it settled into an uncomfortable unease. He tried to pull away, but her grip remained firm, and so Chime turned his head away, instead his voice turning to a near whisper. "It's not like I'm gonna break apart." He tried to continue, but the pretender cut him off, holding out his hand so it would fill his peripheral vision. "Are you sure?" she questioned, tone turning more stern while she leaned in closer. Chime flinched away, his hand tightening into a fist. However, it soon relaxed, though not by Chime's own accord. The pretender sighed, glancing away from Chime's eyes and instead going back to his hand. "What did that thing do to you?" It wasn't a question, it was more like a statement, one that made Chime scoff, though it wasn't directed at the pretender. "Should have seen what I did to it." There was venom in Chime's tone, venom that, to the pretender, sounded completely alien. Chime sighed, slumping down slightly to rest his head on the side of the boat, which gave the pretender the perfect chance to spot more scared skin. It could be seen alongside of his neck, the only part that remained visible thanks to Chime's current position. It acted as confirmation that Chime's injuries extended past his head, which only made the pretender want to press the subject further. But she didn't, as the moment she tried to, she felt as if her throat had sealed shut. Yet she refused to simply let the conversation die out, even if it painful. She knew certain things need to be brought up, no matter how much neither of them wanted to. Thus she steeled her resolve, clearing her throat before she brought up another topic of near equal importance. "What do we do about them?" Chime perked up, lifting his head off the edge of the boat in order to glance at the pretender in the light of his eyes, refocusing within seconds. He nodded towards the ferryman, his voice trying to a near whisper. "Took them to the maw." He answered simply, still keeping his voice to a whisper. She blinked, taking a second to process the statement before slowly her mind deduced the reason. So she nodded slowly, at first still imagining the concept. "Okay. But..." She paused, choosing her next words carefully for both Chime's sake and her own. "Don't you want to see them, to see him?" The singular mention of a certain bag-headed boy made Chime push himself off the boat's edge, now sitting upright while his hand drummed nervously against his knee. "I don't know if I can handle it." The pretender glanced at Chime, ready to retort, but he cut her off, his voice somehow getting lower. "You think you could?" That made he freeze. She couldn't. Not a chance. Not after everything. And so she pulled away, settling in a posture near identical to Chime, the only difference being that her hands were clasped together. A silence held itself over the two, both Chime and the pretender remaining silent, each unable to speak due to a mix of nerves and other melding emotions. It was Chime who spoke next, understanding the need for the current talk while also trying to keep the subject matter as light as possible. So, other than that, despite his best efforts, Chime was unable to keep the talk going. However, he didn't have to. The pretender rested a hand of Chime's shoulder, her grip somehow firm yet gentle. Just talk to us. Okay? Chime paused, turning slightly to meet her gaze before he nodded, rolling his neck to try and lessen his nerves. Yeah, okay. Now sitting in a far more comfortable atmosphere, the two found themselves engaging in simple small that, while holding no real importance, acted as a metaphorical breath of fresh air, something they both desperately needed. Over on the other side of the boat, Otto and the North stood watching now fully revealed ocean that stretched beyond the horizon. Otto stood tall, holding his arms behind his back, while the North Wind sat along the edge, kicking his feet without a care in the world. Letting out a sigh, Otto pushed his glasses back up his face, rubbing at his nose while he did so. The North Wind picked up on the hidden reasons for Otto's exhausting choosing to huff in slight annoyance. "Dude, you worry too much," he huffed again, leaning back to looking into the late evening sky. Otto glanced towards the North Wind, only sighing deeper at the carefree attitude he almost never dropped. "You really don't have any more questions?" Despite the skepticism in Otto's tone, he knew fine well that the North Wind truly didn't care, or rather he was truly to feel worried. The North Wind scoffed, rolled his head with sarcastic flair. "Oh, come on, we'll be fine." Otto remained silent, although only briefly, as he let his gaze fully settle on the North Wind, his tone turning more serious while he also got quieter. "That thing hurt him." The North Wind froze in place, the surrounding air touring eerily still. Slowly the North Wind twisted towards Otto, and despite the lack of any facial features, the almost dangerous expression was easy to see. "You heard him. He will kill it." Otto listened to the North Wind's jarring deadpan tone, however he never wavered. "North?" For what the statement lacked in length, it made up for in underlying depth. Turning back to stare at the ocean, the North Wind huffed, relaxing his posture. I know, just we're all here, we're all back. Don't ruin that." Even though the last section was structured as a demand, it sounded more as a plea, one that spoken softly and without much of the North Wind's usual energy. "Don't be so dour," the gruff voice of the ferryman whispered. Otto and the North Wind perked up at the sound, turning to see the ferryman, who was keeping his eyes ahead at the ever-expansive sea. "We'll just take this one day at a time." Otto sighed at the ferryman's blunt logic, though he found the simplified viewpoint oddly comforting. As it turns out, the North Wind was just as appreciative, if not more, as he began to regain his childlike excited, while he lightly jabbed an elbow into Otto's side. "Exactly so, just lighten up, dude. It's better than before." Letting out another sigh, the ferryman began to paddle with slightly more intensity. "Agreed. But enough on that. Can't stay out here forever." With that, they returned to what they were doing before settling into a cozy calm. Thus hours passed as Chime and the pretender tried to chip away on the time they had spent apart. Otto and the North Wind continued to discuss various random topics. The ferryman kept rowing the boat with a single-minded determination, and finally Mush spent his time trying to sink back in corner as much as possible. By the time they had began to approach their destination, it was the dead of night, the stars lighting up the sky like a child's nightlight. To contradict the natural beauty of the night sky, a sight of opposite grace could be seen off in the distance. Thanks to darkness of the night, it was almost impossible to make out what exactly came up out of the water, unless whoever already knew what it was. Leaking out from a man-made section of carved-out ocean was an endless stream of wispy steam floating out in a semicircle. However, there was more to the strange sight, as right next to the steam pitch-black smoke always floated out, filling the over half of the Titanic circle. Simply put, it was a vast circle made from steam on one side and smoke on the other, with a line to split them down the middle. Eventually the boat drifted next to the steam side of the circle, resting nearest its peak, causing the groups to divert their attention towards the wall of steam. Placing the oars back into their holsters, the ferryman slowly stood up his Titanic frame, making the boat rock slightly as he did so. Slowly he turned, facing the wall of steam, without much of a reaction, as he instead held his arm out to the side. Within seconds his arm had shifted, going from a short yet bulky limb to a long thin chain with a hook attached to the end. He dropped his newly morphed limb into the pitch-black waters, letting it sink deeper and deeper to what seemed like impossible lengths. After what seemed like hours but what was in truth only a minute, the ferryman's shifted limb gently tapped against what he was looking for. Moving the chain around for only a second, the ferryman felt as the hook latched around a handle fitting perfectly around his hook hand. Wrapping his free arm around the chain, the ferryman took a long, deep breath before he pulled. His shoulders tensed, the boat beginning to sway left and right as he tried to keep his balance, yet even with his visible struggle, the others never showed any signs of nerves or weariness. Instead, they watched with relaxed postures, all showing a casual trust that demonstrated unmatched confidence. Sure enough, after a few more seconds, the handle was pulled out of its place, which was when the mechanical magic began to whirl. Within seconds, the surrounding water began to boil, bubbles popping along the surface. Next came the hissing, a high-pitched sound that leaked from around the boat. Finally, a visible change made its appearance alongside the noise, coming in the form of 4 copper walls that reached out from the water surrounding the boat with a rusty screech. The walls rose around the group, locking into place once they were just above the height of the boat. Another hiss sounded from below the water as a thick copper floor slid out from one of the walls, settling just underneath the boat, pushing it upwards slightly. Yet another screech came as a sign for more mechanical movement, this time acting as part of the same floor pulling back into the walls. However, once it did, it revealed how the first section of the floor was riddled with holes, almost like a cheese grater. Once the bottom section of floor clicked, slunk back into place, the water that was held within the walls began to drain to a ludicrous degree, like shattering the bottom of a glass. Slowly, the floor began to roll down the walls, taking the boat along with it into constantly growing darkness. As the boat was carried further and further down, the 6 found themselves lost in their own thoughts. The ferryman tried to mentally prepare himself for whatever they could face. Otto tried to plan out the best possible route. The north wind reminisced on before the cycle, particularly the fun they had. Mush remained indifferent as he tried to keep himself as calm as possible. The pretender rolled her eyes at her own memories, and finally Chime was trying to recall everything he could about the place they would soon truly enter. After a few minutes of sinking deeper and deeper, another mechanical creak sounded from the front. The next sudden change came in the form of light, which leaked out from a wall that was beginning to rise upwards like a gate to a castle. The wall rose higher and higher, letting more light burst towards the group, forcing them to cover their eyes with a hiss of annoyance. Eventually their vision adjusted, allowing the group to see what was beyond the walls. A city. A mechanical city, to be more precise. Copper pipes lined the tightly packed buildings, while steam filled the air, warping it with sheer heat. Each section of infrastructure wrapped around each other, every last inch of space being taken up with something like a building or a walkway. Stepping out onto one of the walkways, the group took a moment to reacquaint themselves with the steampunk-style city. Chime stepped in between the bars of the railing, trying to look through the fog like steam. The north wind kept a carefree posture as he slid his feet across iron floor, spinning around slowly to take in the sights. Otto remained focused on forming a plan, trying to map out the walkways the best he could. Mush stayed indifferent, although he gave the area a small glance, whipping beads of sweat that were already beginning to form. The pretender continued to be stoic, crossing her arms while she waiting for the others to move. Shifting once again, the ferryman returned back to his true form as he pulled away tufts of silver hair that had somehow already stuck to his face. He stepped next to Chime, also trying to look past the steam, though with noticeably less focus. Instead, he glanced at Chime, his expression making it clear he wanted to say something, but he found the words too difficult to say. Chime picked up on his friend's hesitance, immediately giving him a small nod that told him it was okay to say whatever he was thinking. Taking in a deep breath, Joseph spoke his mind. "Feels like old times." Chime paused, slightly shocked at the statement, before he chuckled, a raspy sound that lifted Joseph's dour mood. The slight upbeat to the atmosphere was cut off, however, as Chime leaned back against the railing, his own posture how making it clearly he had something to say himself. Joseph raised an eyebrow, more curious rather than concerned. "What is it?" he asked, watching for any ticks Chime could give off. Nothing. It's kinda greedy." Joseph raised an eyebrow, settling into a more casual stance. "Can't be that bad," he stated, simply waiting for Chime to continue. Letting out a small huff, Chime caved, holding out his hand. "Can I have my hat back?" That made Joseph blink in confusion, before he scratched at his head. His fingers pushed into the fabric of the fedora, which reminded him of who the hat truly belonged to. With an almost frantic panic, Joseph clutched at the fabric, shoving it into Chime's hand with blinding speed. Right? Right? Sorry, Chime chuckled, giving Joseph a small nod before he placed the hat on his veil of hair. The hat didn't fit, it more so just sat on Chime's hair. But still it felt right. The others noticed Chime's addition to his attire, stepping over to him and Joseph. With that, the group carried on into an adventure just like the old days. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, a much more dramatic scene was unfolding. Being carried down by a lift similar to the one used by the ferryman was a boat. However, there was some key differences. The sheer scale was the most prevalent, for while the ferryman entrance was made from with the dimensions of his boat in mind, this elevator was enormous in comparison. The same could be said for the boat, a massive ferry. One that wasn't in the best condition. In truth, the thing looked like it had been through a battlefield, with most of its upper hull missing while fire damage stretched across everything else. The ship leaned against one of the elevator's walls, keeping it upright as it lowered further and further down. Unlike with the ferryman and the others, however, one of the wall did in fact not immediately open up to grant passage. Instead, the ship's inhabitants were met with the sight of a hulking electric field on that acted like a door. Standing in front of the field were 2 guards, each of average height yet incredibly chubby. It wasn't their build or uniform that would bring them attention. No. The source of their regard would come from the crude bits of metal that jutted out of their skin. Consisting of mostly copper wires of pipes, the metal instruments were kept poorly hidden under the guard's skin, steam leaking out from their pores every few seconds. Watching in shock and confusion as the main door to the ferry was kicked off, the guard braced themselves as a small metal bridge shot out, landing on the elevator floor, before a horde of fat and plump residents charged towards them. The horde pulled back once they reached the guard, who flinched back as the mass of other residents began to howl, a mix of incoherent shouts and yells that fought for any kind of presence. The guards tried to regain control, trying to yell over the horde, but the task proved impossible. Until one of the horde made a fatal mistake. Reaching out a bloated hand, one of horde tried to wrap its sausage fingers around the guard's shoulder, attempting to push past. That proved to be the last mistake it ever made. With lightning speed, the guard reached down to its belt, pulling off a copper baton that cracked with electricity. It raised the weapon above its head. The normal resident have only enough time to widen its eyes before the guard swung. Flesh and bone caved under the force, the bloated resident falling to the floor with a thump, the back of his head looking more akin to clay than skin. The sudden spout of violence made the rest of the horde freeze like deers in headlights, while the guards used to the chance to take back control. Both guard held their weapon, barking at the board to step back. The walking sacks of meat complied, shuffling back without a word. Humming in approval, the guard began to drawl out in more nonsensical dribble, the language only being able to be understood by the horde. With that, the selected members of the horde began to explain what exactly had happened to them and the ship they arrived on. But on the said ship, sometime else was developing. Near silent taps echoed across the floorboards as 2 figures tried to get a view of the current scene. They watched with before curiosity and concern, waiting for what the monsters would do. When they saw no changes, they decided to keep moving, making their way to the S side of the boat, the one that rested against the metal wall. Slowly they climbed, boosting each other up, before they eventually managed to reach the ship's edge, granting them a better view. They remained unnoticed, mostly thanks to one factor: their size, or better yet, their lack of size. They were no ordinary figures. No, for standing on the edge of the ferry was a certain bag-headed boy and a girl in a bright yellow raincoat.